So the final type of cognitive function I'm going to talk about are the executive functions. Now, the executive functions are those functions of the brain that are often associated with the frontal lobes of the brain. Now, the frontal lobes of the brain are very large and actually have many different functions. But so let's think about some of them here. So one of the things that the frontal lobes of the brain seem to be important for is the ability to solve problems. Obviously, everyday life can involve having to come across challenges or difficulties and problems to solve. They may be small, relatively trivial problems, or they may be large and complex and difficult to work out problems. But our frontal lobes seem to be important to enable us to do that. And when we talk about problem solving, we're talking about that ability to perhaps first recognize that there is a problem, and then to potentially to think about possible solutions. Now, obviously, for some of our problems in everyday life, the solution comes to mind very quickly, and it's relatively easy. But for some things, we actually have to think a bit more about it. And maybe there are different ways of handling this particular problem. There are different potential solutions. So I have to recollect maybe things that I've done in the past that would be similar, or come up with possible options. And then I have to weigh up that information and make a judgment, think about the pros and the cons, and work out which solution seems most appropriate. And then I might need to make a plan in a sense. So I've got a broad solution, but I'm going to make a plan of action. So the ability to hold things in mind, to weigh up things, and to make a plan again seems to rely on the frontal lobes of the brain. So maybe I make a plan, and of course then I have to actually implement my plan. I have to put it into action. So maybe I've got a sequence of things I need to do, and some of them I can't do straight away, but I have to do after a little while. So I have a task, if you like, or I'm in a task, and then I have to manage that task. So let's say the example of I'm going to I've got I want to cook a special meal for my spouse, and so I've had to think, well, what special meal should I cook? And again, I might draw on my memories, so I know the things that my spouse likes, and so maybe I have to choose one of those things. Okay, so I've weighed up what to cook, and I have made a decision on what I'm going to cook. Okay, so now it comes to, well, actually planning. Well, actually, I need to buy the ingredients, so I may need to do that over the coming days. So then I've got the ingredients. So now we arrive at the time when actually I have to cook, do the meal. So cooking a meal is a really good example of a task that has multiple steps, things that have to be done at different times. Ideally, I need to plan and prepare for it, so I prepare the ingredients so that I'm not having to do them all while I'm in the middle of cooking one part of it. So cooking can be quite a complex activity. And whilst I'm actually in the task itself, I have to remember what I'm going to cook, or the steps. I might use a recipe, and that's useful because I've got the steps laid out, but I need to keep checking them. So I need to be doing the task itself. I have something in a saucepan, I have something in the oven, and I have to go between the two. So I have to manage my activities. And I talked earlier about attention. So here, and multitasking or dividing attention. So here I'm having to manage or control my attention. And this is, again, considered to be one of our executive functions. Executive functions are acting like a controller, if you like, or sometimes people use the example of the conductor of the orchestra. So the conductor of the orchestra is having to control all the other parts of the orchestra. Our executive functions are controlling what we're doing. So we're monitoring are we on track? So am I doing the right thing just now? Am I in the middle of the right step, or actually is there something else that I should be doing? So I should be getting that ingredient ready and then putting that on the stove at the same time as making sure that whatever's on the cooker already doesn't burn, and so on. So I have to manage that task during that activity, and this is an executive function. One of the things that the frontal lobes seem to be important for as well is what we call sort of inhibition. So um, in everyday life, we get into routines or habits, and we sometimes we have to switch those. So to give an example, let's say I drive to work and I take the same route each day, but on one particular occasion I need to go to the dentist. So actually I'm going to take a different route. So in that example, I'm in a habit, I'm in a routine of just driving in a particular way, and perhaps I almost don't think about it too much. But on this occasion, I actually have to inhibit that routine, that automatic response. So I have to stop that and do something else. But inhibition can also be to do with things that we might say or do, where actually we might say something in one situation but not in another, or we might think something but we don't necessarily say it. So and obviously situations where somebody is feeling annoyed or angry are the classic example where you may think something perhaps about another person, but you manage to not say it because you know it won't necessarily be the right thing. Of course, when we're angry or frustrated, the temptation is to say things. And similarly, with a brain injury, that ability to inhibit might be more difficult, and so you're more likely to say something that you wouldn't necessarily have previously said, because it's just more difficult to inhibit what feels like an automatic response. And generally, that one of the things our frontal lobes seem to be doing is enabling us to regulate our emotion and our behaviour. So after a brain injury, emotions are often up and down, or in fact sometimes with a frontal lobe injury, those emotions may be actually flattened. So for some people it's actually they feel much more up and down. And for other people it's more flattened. But that general ability to regulate emotion, to not feel overwhelmed, again can be a function of the frontal lobes. And similarly in terms of behaviour, in terms of what we say and what we do. So when we talk about anger and frustration, I mentioned that inhibition can be more difficult. So of course that could be verbally, so what somebody says, but it also can be what somebody does. So somebody may find it more difficult to not lash out both physically and verbally with a brain injury. So the executive functions and the functions of the frontal lobes are complex. There are many different functions, and they all depend upon each other. But with a brain injury, let's say, it may be more difficult to solve problems, more difficult to recognise that there are problems. We often talk about it feeling like it's more difficult to be aware of one's difficulties. So having an awareness of difficulties can be challenging, because the cognitive systems that enable us to notice things in the world, to monitor ourselves, to attend, and to pick up things, or perhaps to get feedback from other people in the world. Those systems are not working so well. So actually, it's then harder to notice that you have a difficulty with something. And if you don't notice you have a difficulty with something, then it's harder to do something about that. And similarly, even if you are trying to solve a problem, if it's hard to hold things in mind and to work on things in mind, then that can be challenging. Similarly with making plans, so if it's difficult to think through and make a plan, what might happen is that you do the first thing that comes to mind, and of course that can feel like somebody is being impulsive. So if somebody hasn't been able to think through the consequences of what they're going to do, so if that part of planning is difficult, what that means is it's difficult to anticipate that perhaps a negative consequence, something, a bad thing will happen, and somebody looks like they are acting without thinking, and that can make the person seem impulsive. And similarly, when one's doing a task, a complicated task, or just a task with several different steps, it's possible to get your attention to be caught on one step and just miss the fact that something else should be being done now, or I was supposed to stop this task and do something else at a particular time, and actually your attention is caught up with this task, and so the overall main job doesn't get done. The meal doesn't get cooked, for example. So all of these difficulties with executive functions can cause real challenges in everyday life. So one of the things that I have highlighted, I think, throughout these topics, is the point that cognitive systems, our emotional functions, and our physical functions all interact with each other. As I said earlier, cognitive difficulties, emotional difficulties, and physical functions will all create difficulties in everyday life, with things we do, activities of daily living, or our ability to work, to engage in leisure and social activities, do things in our communities, and sustain relationships. And as we said, we've been thinking about cognition today, but emotion impacts on cognition, and physical functions impact on cognition, and cognition impacts on physical function. So as I said, with things like when it's harder to think things through, it's more effortful, it's more demanding. So that, for example, creates more fatigue. When one is fatigued and tired, frustrated, that leads to frustration, and so having emotional consequences. So all of these things interact and affect our everyday functions.